have a seat.
Shall I put my black butt on the flag?
For those of you who've noticed that this flag is very dirty, it's artificial dirt. It's stage dirt, so our bums should be protected. Yes. There are so many questions because there's such a range in the topics covered here. But I think what we were trying to do when gathering all of you here is to think about restrictions on protests and then the kind of tactics that manage to persevere somehow. And what we've seen is, of course, I want to just like acknowledge the range of I guess the reactions to protests, the kind of violence that people have met, also the difference in tactics, like the artist boycott. What does it mean? You know, of course, it's quite different to be withdrawing or changing the artwork that you're including in a biennial, and I think the very moving images of Pinar deleting her own history, kind of as out of fear for this. For this terror of the state, really. So one of the questions I have is, of course, we're talking about, I think, with the stage here is somehow this post 9/11 world, and the restrictions of protests that have been mounting. Although, of course, we've heard from Nadine that this has a longer tail, that it's not like a new phenomenon. I don't think we want to pretend that it is. But what it's interesting to me how there are certain kinds of protests that are fine, you know, like what I would call the parade protest, where we all gather, sort of like what I was describing a little bit, like you're in a sanctioned, you're in a cordoned area. Sometimes protests can even have corporate sponsors, like what happened, you know, like with recent protests against environmental protests. I think there were corporate sponsors in New York, or there can be like, or you know, it has this kind of marketing feel to it. You know, at least even if there aren't sponsors, there are kind of people with greenwashing products that would like to have them associated with the protests, so we buy them and think that and feel better. So my question is, do those kinds of protests, in a way, like the more benign protests that don't really shake up anything, versus the kinds of protests that we've also heard here that are actually locking down, like you have concrete locks on your arms, of course, causing risking yourself, your own body, in different ways, and also what we saw with Pinar. Like, is the benign protest at all effective at all, or do we need to just kind of what your experiences are? You know, from Joanna talking about the boycott, would you consider that an effective boycott or an effective protesting strategy? Like, would you, yes or no, sort of kind of question? And then just to hear from all of you, given that you're talking on such different topics, you know, how you respond to this kind of question. Trying to sum it up here. Yeah.
Well, yes, on one hand, it's pretty interesting that those art boycotts are detached in a way from the real political movement, but on the other hand, they have very much exposure. You know, that they operate a little bit like art with symbolic power, and I would see a possibility of this symbolic exposure being linked with the real movement. I think that there is a tedious, work done by activists on everyday basis that artists could maybe respect or highlight more, and in order to make those boycotts more efficient. It was not so much the case in these instances, but I think, you know, that when we speak about activist art, we should not speak about artists who now out of the sudden think that art can change everything. Art can probably not change anything by itself. It can only change something if it's in the real connection. And,
right. So this idea that it would have to connect with other movements, that that there are these connections that could be made where you're actually articulating some grievances that have been named elsewhere that are kind of brought into different stages and spoken by different people, and that way
Yeah, I would say so. And
yeah.
also just to add some anecdote, a friend of mine, a Russian curator, said that perestroika in Russia at the end of 80s, happened first in the artists' minds. That they were like the first to be really open for any kind of change. And through this artistic mindset, it has been very much inspiring also for other parts of society to be ready for a change. So maybe there is something to it.
Do you have any, Nadine, do you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it really depends on where you are in terms of context, and I think Pinar would obviously agree, like what you might imagine to be the sort of safe protest, that just crowds gathering in some places would be impossible, or itself taking a massive risk, like in Egypt today. Only a few years ago we could go on marches and we could protest, and now the risk of just joining a few people and walking to Tahrir Square, as we've seen, has ended in people just laying flowers, being shot and killed. So I think context really matters. So I mean that's a context obviously very close to me. But also I'm thinking about the British context and kind of thinking about, as you say, that the sort of safe march is not being very effective as a means of protest. In the sense that if you compartmentalize and contain protesters and give them permission, I mean, as we've seen through history, it's really direct action and kind of and sort of pushing limits that ends in things changing. And one of the things that I campaign a lot and have been involved in activism in Britain is actually around Australia House in London, to try to get the camps on Nauru and Manus closed, where Australia basically indefinitely detains refugees, mostly racialized as Muslim, and subjects them to torture. And both have UN committees plus Amnesty International, etc., have released reports demonstrating they're subjected to torture. People have died in those camps, and they've also set themselves on fire, etc. So one of the things that we try to do is to take creative direct action kind of protest, because I think one of the things we realize is that if we're not going to solve racism. I mean, I regard racism as being at the heart of what allows something like that to happen. The level of dehumanization that has to be going on here of a certain group of people must be so extreme, because this is one thing we do know about. We do know this is happening and it still carries on. I think that what you kind of need to do is need to push people, people in power, predominantly white men in power, in Australia, for example, to the point where they're so uncomfortable that they have to change the policy. But they're not going to suddenly think, oh, this is a bit mean, this is a bit nasty, this is a bit racist. Because actually, if you look at the Australian nation, it precisely depends on white supremacy. Its sovereignty is challenged by the existence of people who are still there, who challenge the sovereignty of Australia. So you're not just going to get them to change their mind, but you want to make it so uncomfortable for them that they're going to change the policy nevertheless. And I think that's often what protest does. That's what direct action does, that's what occupations do. It just, if you make the economy unsustainable, if you make it very uncomfortable for these very posh, rich white people attending Australia House for concerts because there's always something going on outside, then they're just going to, we'll just change the policy because we want to get on with their everyday lives. And I think that's the sad thing about it, really.
Yeah, maybe I can point a little bit about Gezi Park resistance, because it was the most visible resistance in Turkey, and actually it was so creative resistance, not only because of the artists joined, also the people, the other all activists, they were so creative. And all the banners and slogans changed during Gezi Park resistance. The old style slogans totally changed just in couple of days. And I found it very creative and very fresh, actually. And there were many university people, young people, joined to the resistance. And the young generation always called, like they are not political people. They all they don't think about politics. But when the Gezi Park resistance start, we saw their real face during the resistance, and I think we won the at the end, actually, because they were trying to cut the trees and want to make an old military building as a new shopping center or some opera house. Every day they change the idea of this new building. They want to reconstruct it, but at least they couldn't. But nowadays they still want to do it again. You know, after all this protest, everything, they still want to do it again. And also some artists during the resistance, especially performer artists, they affected people too much. They changed the people's ideas. You know, especially one guy, performance artist. He was just standing in the middle of square, just standing, nothing, doing nothing actually, and then like people came to join him. Like first maybe 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, and 100 people. They just stand. They were not artists. We were all standing together and just looking to the cultural center, you know. And I think we stopped life around like 1 month. Yeah, yeah, it was so beautiful times actually. Yeah.
I mean, in my city, in Nottingham, we have this place called Speaker's Square. And basically, it's a place where you're allowed to protest, which sort of like is a bit contradictory to me. You apply to do your protest and get permission to do your protest, and then the authorities to say, you may protest or you may not protest. And then you do what the authorities say. And now it's sort of like it's like a program that you get for a theatre. You can actually have a look through the programme of protests that are happening in Nottingham Square that have been booked at Speaker Square, and, you know, oh yes, I like the sound of that one. You know, I know I'm probably being a bit cruel, but, you know, there's some very good vigils and stuff that go on there, and they have a particular purpose. So, you know, bringing people together over a given issue, allowing people to reflect, bringing people who are very new to protest into a safe space where, you know, they can maybe get a flavour for it. So I'm trying to find you know, positive reasons to protest like this. But I guess the best example of a protest in the UK that happens, which is quite non-confrontational in many ways, is the United Family and Friends campaign protest, which both Nadine and I were there last weekend. And that protest has been happening for 18 years. 18 years. Basically, are families in the UK who've lost their loved ones to state violence. And, you know, they joined together from across the UK and they marched from Trafalgar Square to 10 Downing Street, you know, the doorstep of our Prime Minister, every year, very peacefully, you know, with a lot of dignity. There's a part where they just say, stop chanting now, we're now going to walk silently. And this, you know, I was there this year, and there were people around me going, we want to chant, we want to chant. And it's like, well, it's the family's wishes that we're not going to chant, and that's how they choose to do it. So in some ways, you know, it depends on the context, it depends on who's organising and why they want to do that thing in a particular way. And it's not for me or anybody else to say that by marching peacefully and quietly and silently down Whitehall, in that very dignified way, that there's anything at all wrong with that. And the fact that they're still doing it 18 years and not a lot has changed. I mean, we're starting to get some results now, I think, starting to see some, you know, police officers investigated and stuff. So, yeah, it's a mixed bag for me. I mean, for me, direct action all the way. We know, as black people in social justice movements, both here and abroad, that we're not going to get anything done without disrupting some of the narratives that are going on, you know, about black lives. And history shows us that, you know, that's what the media is greedy for. That's the only thing that is going to get us real transformative change in this country.
Another question that comes to mind for me is, all through the morning, I was trying to think about kind of the history of what, you know, Nancy Hollander very sharply said, this kind of post 9/11 world that then Radha questioned. I myself have, even just when preparing for this panel, I was thinking, reading Nadine's paper, thinking about kind of the long tail of this, starting with Peterloo incident. So for me, when I think about this, I think I conceptualize it as, well, we have these, the kind of convenient forms of democracy. For me, I always envision like a private public space where it's really nice. There are trees, there are benches. There's a gate all around it, and it gets locked after dark. Nobody can sleep there. You can't urinate there. But you can go, and if you have, you can go eat your sandwich there and put it in the bin and then leave. So that, for me, is kind of, there's a convenient form of democracy, and then there are all these inconvenience, the direct action protest, which for me, the right to protest is part of it. It's this kind of inconvenient, sometimes people break our stuff and we like our stuff, So thinking about maybe kind of what is the history here? How far back does this go? Is this, to me, I think of the banning the right to protest along, it's kind of like one of the tentacles of austerity measures, of neoliberalism. It's like one of those things that it comes along with these other things. We're going to make people's lives harder, and when they kind of say, no, we don't want to do this anymore, then we say, oh, you can't do that anymore. You can't protest anymore. So I guess it's it's a very nefarious, it's an all over the place question, but that maybe you can just respond to however it speaks to what you're thinking about. But also drawing in, since the overall umbrella of this conference is freedom of speech, and how does freedom of speech relate, which sounds really nice in a lot of ways, and I think most people would agree to, yes, freedom of speech, absolutely. Right to protest, don't want to really ban it, but we don't really love it either. So it's kind of like you can respond how you want to this if you want to. You can also non-respond if it doesn't provoke anything in you.
Nadine?
Nadine looks ready to jump.
I think that, just on what you said just now about, people break our stuff, we like our stuff. I do think that stuff is actually at the center of a lot of this, and by stuff, I mean property. Mm-hmm. If we think about the fact that, the way in which the British state centralized its power was through just saying to people, well, you can't fish there anymore, you can't hunt there anymore, this is now Crown property. In the same way, colonialism, this is now Crown property. Australia, terra nullius. Here, you can have this reservation to Native Americans in the US, and then, the rest is Crown. So a lot of it is about property and, the material and lasting effects of people's lives because of the unequal distribution of property, and indeed its seizure by certain powers. So I do think that's really at the core of it, and therefore, if we maybe take into account charges of criminal damage that may follow protest, if we're going to think about it with that historical understanding in that context, we might think, well, all right then, that's, it's a political act to both say that's mine and not yours, as well as to say, well, you damaged it, and it was mine. That's one thing. And the other thing I was going to say about free speech is that, again, I think it really depends on the context as to how much you want to really defend free speech. And, again, going to Egypt, I think, and Turkey, free speech under attack, what I might say about free speech and defense of free speech there is very different to what I would say about it in a European context, where I actually find that this idea of this absolute right to free speech and defense of free speech is actually a very dangerous liberal idea. And we could see it very clearly in the context of Charlie Hebdo, and which defended its right to publish racist material on the basis of, adhering to this idea of absolute free speech. And what we see then in the Just Tweet Charlie hashtag was the kind of mobilization of that argument that, well, we have a right to say whatever we like. It doesn't matter the effect that it has on you. Kind of not taking into account the fact that people have very unequal positions in society, and that it's certain people have a microphone, certain people have a right to speak, and others don't. And in fact, what you end up doing is just propagating racialization of certain groups and In particular, we're living in a society where Islamophobia and racism in Britain today is very extreme. So I'm very cautious about free speech, and I don't regard myself as someone who defends any kind of absolute idea of free speech. And in fact, if we look to the law, there is no absolute right to free speech. Even if we want to refer to the law, we see that there are limitations on free speech. But I think people often forget that. And particularly sort of mainstream right-wing liberal forces when it comes to kind of trying to push for this idea of absolute free speech. I think it can be quite dangerous in societies where there are problems of structural racism, very deep problems of structural racism.
It's kind of like a minority majority. So in what you're saying, at least in Europe, there's the majority speaking out against minorities, and then what we're advocating for is actually minorities in the right to protest, being able to speak to society, speak out against majorities.
Yeah,
right?
and being protected from certain kinds of speech because that kind of speech is racist, or it propagates and entrenches structural racism. Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's like about power and control, and where that lies, and threats not necessarily to stuff, although the whole thing about capitalism in relation to this thing is another thing. But it's about who has the right to power and control. So the day after our protest in Nottingham, we had the EDL, which is a far-right organisation. The Notts police granted them permission to have their protest because, we have the right to protest in the UK. I'm not sure what they did was a protest, but nevertheless, they were granted their free speech, which actually consisted of hate crime, just racist filth towards minority ethnic and migrant communities, violence, so they were throwing smoke bombs, throwing missiles. It cost so in terms of our stuff, it cost our city £220,000, and they actually shut down the same road that we had shut down the day before. So the Notts police shut down the same road for a racist group of right-wing protesters to have that liberty in our city. It ended in 2 people being charged. There were 4 protesters on our action. We all got charged 100%. There were many more EDL protested in this sort of, I don't even know if you can call it a march or whatever. 2 people ended up getting charged. In terms of, again, 2 weeks, if you fast forward 2 weeks, in London, some people may have heard of City Airport in London being closed down. City Airport in the UK is our business airport. So if this group of protesters, in the name of Black Lives Matter, and it was legitimately in the name of Black Lives Matter, actually compromised airport security. So it wasn't the road to the airport, it was actual airport. They made their way in a small dinghy across a stretch of water, got themselves onto the runway of City Airport, and basically they connected them, they lay down, connected with concrete blocks to each other and to a structure formed on the airport runway. That cost thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money. But all the activists were white. So they were doing it in the name of Black Lives Matter, but they were actually environmental activists, and they were white. Basically, the police took quite a long time in safely cutting them out of these concrete blocks. They even went to find a helmet for the guy who was on top of this structure to make sure he was safe and didn't fall and hurt himself. And not long after, they were put through the court system, got fined about £85 each. And this was thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds worth of cost to the taxpayer. Had those activists been black, I'm sure the policing response would have been something around anti-terrorism. Yeah, so, there's no way. I mean, the activists on the road to Heathrow 2 weeks before were black activists. They were on the road to Heathrow, not a runway. They were dragged in their concrete blocks off that road. And if you stand in those concrete blocks, they're heavy. That could break your arms. They were dragged by police off that road. They lasted about 25 minutes. The white activists, for the same cause, on Heathrow runway were given hours of police time, cutting them carefully out of these concrete blocks. And we knew this would happen. That's why we use the word activists. But, you know, it's not always about stuff. It's not always, it's about, you know, who's allowed to have the power. They don't want black activists to be heading up our own movements. It's okay for white ones to appear. It's okay for EDL to, you know, spew hate and all the rest of it. But they don't want black activists, an intelligent movement, to be leading on our own liberation in the UK or anywhere else, I'd argue. Probably gone off your question, but the point I suppose I wanted to make.
Right, so I think, of course, and it's a really important fact to emphasize that the right to protest is not universal, and it's very unequally legislated. So I think I'm being whispered at. I'm sorry I took so much time, but we have a coffee break now, so there will be ample opportunity to chat in a more informal, less nationalistic stage for the conversation to follow. So thank you so much.